Welcome to a new Daily Top Askreddit video. Today's topic: what is the most disturbing thing to know? I work as an anesthesiologist. I've put people to sleep in an emergency situation knowing that they will almost certainly not survive the surgery. These are generally situations where without surgery the patient will not survive, but even with surgery the chances of survival are still small. In most of these instances the patients are too obtuded or aren't conscious enough to be aware of the gravity of their situation, but in a number of instances the patients have been conscious, talking although clearly anxious. I try to reassure and tell the person that we won't leave their side, that we will take care of them and that they will be fine. It kind of fucks me up a bit to say this to someone, but I always include the last part because I just don't see the point in telling them the truth. I had one guy tell me he felt like he wasn't going to make it. I told him he would make it but knew he wasn't going to. I put him to sleep knowing that the last human face he would see before he died was mine as he stared up at me as I held an oxygen mask over his mouth and nose. I'd consider myself quite a resilient person, but knowing this stuff is a bit of a load to carry around. Alright, that's enough of this thread for today. Yep, first post and I am out of here. Kudos to that dude, he's a fucking hero, but ooh thank you. I am not strong enough to carry that kind of weight. That the adults don't know what's going on either. Reminds me of a quote. Anyone who isn't confused doesn't really understand the situation. There's another one that I don't know exactly, but it goes something like: when you reach the age your parents had you and realize they were people just like you who also didn't have a clue. I worked as a palliative carer for about 3 years. I looked after terminally ill people who had chosen to die at home after being discharged from hospital. After a while, you learn some telltale signs that people are deteriorating. After a bit longer, you start to learn how long people generally have left, even down to a few hours. I always went with honesty. I felt it was my job to support the patients' families as well as the patients, so if they asked how long I thought they had left I would answer honestly, obviously with the disclaimer that I wasn't a doctor and I could only base it on my previous experiences. The wife of one of my patients told me that their children, adults, were visiting the following weekend to say their goodbyes. I had to decide carefully on what to say next, but I ultimately chose to recommend that they visit the following day, at the latest. I regretted saying it because she was devastated. She took my advice and her husband passed away peacefully 48 hours later, after seeing his kids. I'm glad I did it, but upsetting that lady was absolutely gut-wrenching. Some people didn't want to know, and it was their right not to know. That was the worst. In those cases, you had to not say anything. Sometimes they'd say see you tomorrow and I had to reply, yes, have a good night and I'll see you in the morning, knowing full well that they were going to pass in the night. Edit. Wow, thank you all for your kind words. It is a very difficult but rewarding job. I am no longer a carer, but I often think about whether I would be able to do it again. I've had one question asked a lot in the reply, so I'll answer it here. Death, like life, is different for everybody. Certain conditions will cause the body to deteriorate in different ways. I'm going to spoiler this next bit because it might be too much for some to read. COPD was a common condition I saw, that was a gradual decline until the patient could no longer breathe and the oxygen just wasn't able to get in anymore. Heart failure was similar, a very drawn-out process. I cared for a lot of cancer patients, some younger than my parents, which was quite distressing. What tended to happen was the symptoms they already presented would worsen, beyond the point that their medication could alleviate it. They would lose energy, ultimately being bedbound. The biggest giveaway was when they no longer wanted to drink water, that was usually a 72-hour warning. When they were very close, their skin would start to mottle and go pink/purple. I'm not 100% sure why it happened, but I think it was because the heart was struggling to get the blood around and it would settle. However, generally you could just tell that the person you'd been seeing for days, weeks, months or even years just wasn't the same as they were a few days before. Changes could be gradual or sudden. I went to work with the philosophy that death comes for everybody. If it were me being cared for, then I would want to be cared for in a certain way, the way I tried to care for everybody whose homes I entered. While what you said upset that wife in the moment, I'm sure she and the kids were grateful for what you did for them when looking back later on. Yeah, they were gonna be upset no matter what. The kids would have been far more upset had they not seen their dad, compared to how upset the wife was when Op broke the news. Nurse here. I also have to remind people that even though a client is non-responsive and passing, they can hear everything. I've seen a patient who's non-responsive have tears down their face because a family was tearing itself apart airing grievances in the room when they were on their deathbed. This is so incredibly sad. I tell people that hearing is the last thing to go. I try to play music they like, tell them everything that I am doing, and get certain conversations out of the room. My mum was a nurse for many years and she said the same thing. One thing she told me about that really struck me was when patients themselves knew how long they could hold on for and held on long enough to say goodbye to their families. My mum said that there would often be times when a patient would have their children visiting and the patient would already have told my mum that they would be happy to go after saying their goodbyes, and sure enough, as soon as the patient's children had left the ward the patient would go into cardiac arrest or something similar and that would be it. Apparently it was crazy the number of times patients had passed mere minutes after their loved ones had left after saying their goodbyes, but my mum said that lots of them seemed to have already made up their minds that once they'd said goodbye they would pass. As soon as the patient's children had left the ward the patient would go into cardiac arrest or something. This was my father who passed in 2019. My entire family, mother/father, siblings, their kids, had gotten together every Sunday for lunch for the last 20 years or so at least. I lived an hour or so away from my parents' house so couldn't make it every Sunday but I did make it most weeks. My mother called me the Saturday before he died and said he wanted everyone to be there if possible since it had been a bit since all of us were able to make it at the same time. We were all there. He got to see all of his grandchildren one last time, and then passed away quietly in his sleep in his bedroom while everyone was eating and talking. It was fucking devastating for us but we were all there to support each other and we all agreed there was no other way we would have preferred it to happen. When we called his hospice aide she said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I should have been there but I honestly thought he had another few days." We assured her all was well and that he passed peacefully. Obviously I can't really know but I presume it's like a feeling the patient has. When my grandfather was in the hospital with cancer, all of his 5 kids, my dad and my aunts and uncles, all went to visit him. My father was last, because he was the only one living in the US while everyone else was back in Hong Kong. When my dad could finally fly back to Hong Kong, he visited my grandfather in the hospital. My grandfather passed away the next day. Everyone always said that it was like he was waiting just long enough to see his son for the final time. Early childhood malnutrition, between ages 0 to 5. Causes irreversible loss of IQ, 11 to 20 points, and predisposes people to higher levels of violence. Prefrontal cortex doesn't develop the same. And if you miss that window there's no intervention that can recover the gap. I live in South Africa, highest IQ coefficient in the world, highest unemployment, 3rd highest violent crime rate, one of the worst education systems in the world, and it fucking keeps me up at night. I wonder, if we changed nothing except introducing a 1 nutritious meal per day feeding scheme for ECD, what would happen? It hurts. No need to wonder, it's a proven effective strategy. I actually work in the field on this exact research. If you want to dive deeper, you can look into the McGovern-Dole school feeding programs throughout West Africa and Latin America. The outcomes for literacy, math, overall attendance and general health by just ensuring at least 1 solid meal a day are incredible. My son went to a public kindergarten in Brussels, and every day amazed me the focus they had in feeding all the children. He was there from 8 to 5, and he got 5 meals while there. Breakfast, a fruit, lunch, a soup and then dinner, everything made in the kitchen, everything locally sourced. Also they took care that the kid went back home properly bathed. Too bad this level of excellence does not continue in the public grade school, except for the feeding the kids thing, but the actual teaching and the violence is bad. Cruise liners all have a morgue for all the passengers that inevitably die each trip. What an odd way to describe the ocean. Old people love going on cruises, the ocean is God's waiting room. That this post is going to be a BuzzFeed article in about half a week and there's nothing you can do about it. Oh God no. 10 disturbing facts you probably didn't know. Number 7 will make you horny for lobsters. By the time you show the symptoms of rabies, it's already too late. It can also be dormant for a year before you show those symptoms. I have a real fear of rabies because of this. If you ever find a bat in your house, or anywhere you have slept, get the rabies shots. Bats can bite or scratch you and you sometimes won't even notice, especially if you were asleep. A couple of years ago a 20-year-old in BC got out of his car and a bat flew at him. He saw it coming and put up his hand. Because bat bites are so tiny he didn't notice and went about his day. 6 weeks later he showed symptoms and died shortly after. If he had gotten a rabies shot right after being bitten he would have been fine. Long story short, if you get attacked, even if you feel nothing, get a shot right away. Edit, correction, it's rabies shots not rabies shot. If you're really freaked out, get the vaccine. It's super expensive and usually has to be paid for upfront because the health department will specially order it, but if it gives you peace of mind, it's worth it. Source, I work with exotic animals and it was a requirement. Edit, folks, I'm talking about a preventative pre-exposure vaccine since OP said they have a real fear of rabies. This is the 3-shot series that professionals are normally required to receive if they are likely to come in contact with rabies: vet staff, zoo staff, wildlife rehabilitation staff, people who work in labs that handle rabies, etc. This is different from a post-exposure regime.